Hello, welcome everyone. Happy Thursday. Thank you all so much for taking some time and joining us for how to build an experimentation culture for data-driven product development, presented by Product Management Today and sponsored by Statsig. I'm Tara, the webinar manager for Product Management Today, and I'm so excited to bring you this brand new session with such a well-earned insight into building an experimentation culture from the ground up. I'm really looking forward to hearing from Margaret-Ann Seger today and what I'm sure is going to be a fun and valuable conversation. As a reminder, we will be recording this webinar in case you need to leave early. If you happen to miss any part of this webinar, you can go to the registration page where you signed up to access the recording after today's event. We're going to send that link across in the chat for you now as well. Up next, before we go any further, I want to thank Statsig for sponsoring this webinar and helping us to make it all happen. Statsig is the leading experimentation platform for building better software products, combining feature flags, A/B testing, and analytics, and used by leading product companies such as Figma, Notion, Lime, Ancestry, Brex, and more. To learn more about how Statsig can help you, visit statsig.com. So thank you again to Statsig. Up next, let's go ahead and get some technical things out of the way. Please don't hesitate to ask questions during today's event. You can do so by submitting your questions into the Q&A panel found in the bottom bar of this webinar window. Great questions always make for a great webinar, so don't forget to stick around for our Q&A session near the end of the hour to get even more insights and advice from Margaret-Ann. The chat is also available for open discussion, which we love to see. Just know we'll use the Q&A panel for your specific questions so that they don't get lost. My wonderful colleague Tori will be fielding your questions today. She'll be happy to answer anything technical you might have while you're here, and please feel free to pull up the chat or the Q&A panel, say hello, let us know where you're joining from today. Closed captioning is also available for this webinar. To enable this feature, select the More button in the bottom bar of this webinar window and select the Captions option. And lastly, if you have any audio issues during today's presentation, you may choose to dial in by phone. All dial-in information can be found in your webinar confirmation email from Zoom. It is up on the screen, and Tori can also relay it to you at any point if you need it. And with all of that out of the way, again, today I'm so excited to hear from Margaret-Ann Seger. She is a seasoned product leader with experience spanning large organizations like Facebook and Uber to small startups like Statsig, where she leads the product team today. She started her career on Instagram's growth team and moved to Uber to drive international growth efforts during the company's peak expansion period. And today, Margaret-Ann builds tools for teams to ship products and grow their businesses in a more data-driven way. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Margaret-Ann to get us started.
Thank you, Tara. Nice to meet everyone. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about how to build an experimentation culture from the ground up. But I thought it would be fun to start with a little poll just to get us warmed up. So Tara, if you want to trigger the poll, I have two questions for folks. The first is, how many of you would say that you are data-driven, just as a high-level concept? And then the second question is, how many of you launch at least 80% of your product releases as experiments? So let's take 15 seconds to fill this out, and then we'll look at the results.
Absolutely. And be honest. Be honest. I encourage everyone to pop in and choose a response here. Would love to see how this looks. I'm going to give it about 5 more seconds. And I am going to share our results with everybody. All right. Can you see that?
Yes.
Perfect.
Okay, this is great. So it looks like a lot of folks would say they're data-driven at a high level. But then when you ask how many folks actually launch things as experiments, those numbers drop from 53% down to 16% of the audience. So it looks like there's a little bit of a gap there, which is good because that tells me that this is going to be a productive conversation. So let's dive in. All right. So as Tara mentioned, my name is Margaret-Ann, thrilled to be here to talk about experimentation. But before we dive in, I think let's get back to basics and talk about the why. Why is experimentation important? So for me, I tend to draw on my past experiences, and I think a number of times as a consumer PM back in the day at Uber, I can think of instances where I didn't maybe experiment as much as I should have, and I've regretted it. So one of those times was, I'll just set the stage. The year was 2016, and I was responsible for product development for Uber's international markets, namely India and Southeast Asia. And I was collaborating with our core rider team on rolling out a new rider app update. This was like a big app update, total refresh. There were, 10 plus major product changes bundled into 9 months of work. And we were good. We actually rolled this out as an experiment, and it was like a 5% rollout in every market. And we're monitoring kind of our core marketplace health metrics, rides, match rate, all these different things. And things were looking good, but two regions stood out as outliers, of course, India and Southeast Asia. And so I was tasked with go figure out why these two regions are performing disproportionately worse than the other regions. Problem is that going and figuring that out wasn't actually an easy task because, like I said, we bundled 10 plus updates into this app launch. And so pinpointing exactly which update was causing the metrics regression was easier said than done. So feature by feature, we started undoing changes and trying to isolate the root cause. Turns out the root cause was actually the core crux of the redesign. We had flipped kind of the paradigm of the app where, I don't know if folks in the audience took Uber pre-2016, but if you remember, back in the day, you kind of dropped a pin on a map and said, I'm here, come pick me up. And then when the driver arrived, you'd say, hey, I'm going to XYZ. The new app design had front and center this where to box where it was destination first. And this is great for a number of reasons. It lets you get a price estimate up front. It tells the driver where they're going to be going so they can know which trips to accept or not. But in markets like India and Southeast Asia, this didn't work super well because Maps coverage, Google Maps coverage in 2016 wasn't that great. And so you would try to type in an address and it just wouldn't autocomplete, or it would autocomplete to the wrong address. People would get frustrated and they would just cancel out of the app and kill it and go to a competitor. And so, funnily enough, the core crux, the whole reason we had done this redesign ended up being our undoing in those regions. So, what did I learn from this process? Well, obviously a lot about building products for international markets. But I think the other thing I learned is, one, I'm really happy we tested this and that we did roll this out as a metrics-driven, experiment. But two, we probably should have done it more iteratively. We should have made one change at a time, seen the impact of that, made another change, seen the impact, and not bundled, 10 plus changes into one. So I think it speaks to the power of iterative, data-driven experimentation and what can happen when you don't do that. The reality, though, is that my experience at Uber wasn't unique. Lots of teams, arguably most teams these days actually, aren't launching products in this iterative, data-driven way. And as a result, the impact is that they're actually leaving money on the table. So let me break that down and explain why. So on the left here, it's pretty intuitive that some features are naturally going to be winners and some aren't. Ronnie Kohavi, who's a very well-seasoned kind of product experimentation guru, has written extensively about his experiences across a variety of different companies like Microsoft, Airbnb, and Amazon. And he's kind of observed this consistent rule of thirds, is what he calls it, where most companies don't have an experimentation hit rate above 30%. So that means that a third of your features are going to be winners. A third are going to be neutral at best, maybe, require some iteration to become positive. And then a third of your features that you launch are actually bad. They're bad for your top line metrics. They're hurting things. And so let's pretend you didn't experiment, you didn't measure the impact of your launches, and you just shipped everything. At a top line, your metric curve might look like this. But under the hood, each time you're shipping a poor performing feature without realizing it, there's, active degradation of your top line metrics. So imagine instead of just blindly shipping everything, you started to use data to determine which of your features are winners and which aren't so great. And you only launched the winners and rolled back all of the features that weren't very well performing. Well, you might actually shift your top line metric trajectory in a meaningful way. And so if you're not doing this as a company today, you're leaving money on the table. And smart companies realize this and make sure that they're, being super data driven with how they build and only launching their winners. So before we hop into the nitty gritty of how you get from kind of blindly launching everything to being super methodical and data driven, I think it's helpful to paint a picture of what the ideal end state looks like. Like what really constitutes a great experimentation culture. So oftentimes when people think of, great experimentation cultures, they think of the FAANG companies or Mang or, whatever they're called these days. I can't keep up. These companies, run every launch like an experiment. They reliably make decisions to roll out or roll back their features using data. And they actually empower their entire company with data to the point that impact, kind of becomes this shared language of prioritization. However, that said, that's great, it's wonderful, but these companies also have access to unparalleled resources like custom in-house tooling for experimentation needs and whole teams of data scientists embedded within different product orgs. And so this can kind of feel like an unattainable end state for a lot of companies who aren't maybe FAANG level resourced. Good news, though, is that more than ever, this flavor of data-driven experimentation culture isn't just siloed into the FAANG companies. At Statsig, I've worked with companies like Rec Room, who go from 0 to 150 experiments a year, or Notion, who went from single digit to hundreds of experiments per quarter, and a whole plethora of other startups or small mid-sized companies like Lime or Whatnot or OfferUp, who just meaningfully increase their experimentation velocity without having to invest a ton in this kind of in-house tooling stack. So that's FAANG, that's what good looks like. But how would you define that more broadly? Like, what are the attributes that make up good experimentation cultures? Well, in my experience, I think we've seen three things that are true if you've built a great experimentation culture. The first is that decisions are going to be made using data in a distributed bottoms-up way across the company. The second is that outcomes are going to be measured on both short-term, i.e. experiment level, and then longer term, like quarter or half or even year long time horizons. And then the third is that data will be seen as empowering. It's not a nice to have, but like a true need to have. It is part of the core cultural fiber of a company. So let's double click on each of these a little bit. So the first, distributed decision-making at scale. Have you ever been at a company where your work is blocked on someone, because they haven't approved a decision or they have to run it up the chain to get leadership to approve? This is basically the opposite effect of distributed decision-making at scale. When companies have a truly distributed bottoms-up culture, good tooling enables easy measurement and quantification of outcomes so that people are talking in a shared language and can make easy decisions, right? Like when you have data, it's pretty easy to say, is this good? Is this bad? Should we ship? Should we not? There's no blocking on someone's opinion or waiting on someone higher above you to make a decision. And what's cool about this is if this is done well, teams actually become self-optimizing, right? So once they know what they're being measured on and what they're optimizing for, they can pivot to actually build based on new inputs and results as they come in versus waiting on leadership to set direction top down once a quarter or once a half or whatever the planning cadence is. The last thing that's kind of neat here is that, the structure of the organization starts to change when data is deployed. So teams start to own outcomes like key metrics, not product surfaces. And so, a team might touch 7 different product surfaces or different things in different organizations because that enables their goal, even though they don't own those product surfaces. So it kind of shifts how the organization actually functions day to day. Second is that outcomes are measured on both short and long-term time horizons. So in an ideal world, teams are constantly thinking about impact, but they're not just like juicing for short-term impact. I'm sure folks have seen, folks who kind of try to game things with a quick win experiment at the end of the half. That's not the ideal state. Teams are measuring the impact of individual week-long experiments, and those are kind of individual data points, but then they're also running, a long-term holdout across all their feature launches and experiments. And the holdout will help them quantify the true impact of their changes in aggregate over this longer term time horizon. Holdouts are really interesting. Every company does them differently, but often they're configured as like a team level holdout or an org level holdout over the period of, whatever the business measures, right? Whether it's quarters or halves or even year long. And then they help this team justify their impact at the end of the half and help plan for the next half. In extreme cases, companies might actually set up very long-term holdouts. If they're launching a set of features they're worried might be detrimental to the user experience, they might do this, or they just want to see, interaction effects amongst different launches over time. An example here that I always find fun is Facebook actually had an ads holdout for 10 plus years. 1% or so of people actually, those lucky people, did not see ads on the Facebook platform at all. And I think that's, a testament to Facebook's true commitment to being data-driven, because that's a lot of revenue they were leaving on the table running that holdout, and they were willing to do it to see, hey, let's make sure we're not degrading the experience too much for these folks. And then last but not least, data is seen as empowering. In organizations where data isn't being used as the common language, it comes down to a matter of opinion when you're making a final decision. Who speaks the most confidently, or worse, who's the highest paid person in the room, the so-called hippo. That's a Ronnie Kohavi term, which I always enjoy. When you have data, this culture can't thrive. It just doesn't work. A healthy experimentation culture fosters discussion around experiment wins and losses, and people actually love launching experiments that aren't good, that are losses, right? Because they can be learned from, you can take those learnings and you can integrate them into future experiments. Iteration is encouraged and celebrated, and people view impact ultimately as the key to success, and don't just talk about, hey, I launched 10 things. They say, hey, I had a 1% impact on DAO or revenue. One kind of final end state here that I find interesting is when impact is such a shared language that people actually start incorporating it into their performance reviews, right? So at the end of the half, when you're talking about what you did that half, you're talking in terms of, hey, I had X impact based on these 10 experiments or based on this holdout group. So that's an image of kind of, end state, ideal nirvana. What does good look like? But great experimentation cultures aren't built overnight. And so I think the next natural question, obviously, is how do you get there as an organization? So at Statsig, we've kind of mapped out this journey in a framework called walk, jog, run, fly. And each phase has a series of activities that you can do and expected outcomes to achieve when you've kind of completed each phase. So let's dive into it and actually take a look at what each of these phases entail. All right, phase 1, walk. So phase 1 is all about building a data baseline. You might be coming from 0 metric coverage or very shallow metrics, right? Like just clicks or page views or kind of website engagement metrics. And this phase is about improving that baseline to understand your core product and business metrics. So how do you do this? You start by thinking about your business's North Star metrics. Are you a B2B SaaS company? Then maybe you should bubble everything up to ARR. Are you a daily habit consumer app? Maybe then in that case, you care most about DAO or daily active users. So you're going to want to figure out what your North Star is, and then you want to define a key set of growth metrics around this. So maybe that's DAO, WOW, MAU, or growth accounting metrics, retention curves, key funnels. The thing to note here is that, these might be user level metrics if that's your key unit of optimization, or business level, domain level, right? Like if you're a B2B SaaS company, maybe you care about number of new domains on the platform. You should be tailoring this unit to whatever your business cares about most, as reflected in those North Star metrics. The next step is, how do you drive awareness and ownership of these metrics on your team? It's one thing to go create a pretty dash, but if no one checks it, doesn't do much value for the organization. So create the dashboard, send a daily report, get teams' eyes on these every single day, check in on these metrics and sprint planning. Do whatever you need to do to kind of get the team engaged with them and thinking about their impact in terms of these metrics day to day. The next thing that is kind of part of this walk phase is choosing tooling, actually, to automate away much of the extra work and overhead associated with experimenting. So, choosing a good experimentation tool will either replace your data science team if you don't have one, create kind of a data science function. Or if you do have a data science team, scale them by automating away a lot of the repetitive day-to-day work associated with just rote experiment analysis, which frees them up to do more fun, interesting one-off explorations. Another thing that a good experimentation tool does is it actually like creates the right hooks in daily, weekly, monthly behaviors, right? So it might email you when your experiment has hit target duration so that you're not constantly peeking at it. Or it might send you kind of a weekly update of how things are progressing or how your key metrics are doing. So it kind of takes some of the mental load of having to go into the tool and check constantly and automates that away. And then the third thing that really good tooling can do is it actually democratizes access to being data-driven and experimenting. It means that everyone on the team can be in there creating experiments. They don't have to route through a DS or file a ticket or wait in a queue to get data science resources. It just means that everyone can kind of be unblocked to move faster and participate in the experience end to end themselves. All right, phase 2, jog. So, at this point, you've passed the walk phase, you've established your baseline metrics, you have a tool instrumented, you're kind of getting up and running. Once you're here, you're going to want to start thinking about how you deploy that tool to put every launch behind a feature flag and start running things as experiments. So this is going to help you basically start to understand the impact of everything you launch so that you can start to only ship your winners and kill your losers. Remember the rule of thirds I was mentioning earlier? This is where this actually tactically starts to come into play because you're going to start to see, okay, this feature is doing well, launch. This feature is not doing well, roll back. And just starting to scale this as a practice for every launch is key here. And the other thing you're going to start doing in this phase is you're actually going to level up from the basic feature flagging type experiments into full-blown experimentation. So what do I mean by that? Well, you'll actually start to run product development cycles based on hypotheses instead of just random product decisions. And you'll slowly shift towards experiments being the bulk of your roadmap. The other thing you'll do here is you'll start to build a muscle around the life cycle of experimentation. So not just, plugging in some things and running an experiment, but actually having an experiment design doc, maybe even establishing a template for your organization to standardize how people design experiments, having an experiment review, running the experiment, and then having a share out post-experiment review where you discuss learnings, next steps, et cetera, and then write those down somewhere to start building your experiment learnings library. Okay. Phase 3. Let's talk a little bit about run. So in this phase, you're starting to seriously ramp up your experiment velocity, and you might even be like 10xing the number of experiments that you're running. So, experimentation culture is not isolated here. It's like everyone across the organization is starting to experiment. You might have one team who started small, and now they're starting to scale this broadly. And you're going from, this is an actual screenshot we had of a customer where they had like 73 experiments when they started in fall of 2022, and they're up to kind of over 1,600 cumulative experiments today. And in 18 months, that's pretty insane growth. But this is something where you start to see the whole organization leaning in and just launching experiment after experiment. The other thing that you're going to start to do in this phase is it's actually going to inform every part of your product development cycle. So it's not just, come up with an idea, launch an experiment, but you're actually using analytics and data to understand the, kind of opportunities that you have as an organization. And then you're using that from opportunity identification through to feature rollout and success analysis. And then that actually feeds back into the learnings of what should we launch next. And so this kind of drives this virtuous loop where you're identifying a trend via analysis, targeting a feature rollout or experiment to address this trend, and then analyzing the impact of these changes to inform the next set of tests to run. Okay, finally, end state, fly. So in the fly phase, every product launch is an experiment. Experimentation starts to expand across your whole product stack. So it's not just UI, UX experiments, but it's truly, experimentation at every level from the front end to back end to infra to your underlying ML models. And so everyone across the org, every team, every layer of the stack is experimenting. You might be experimenting on pricing, recommendation algorithms, whatever, you want to optimize, you're running experiments. And then last but not least, all three of the conditions that we talked about at the beginning of the presentation are being met, right? So decisions are being made in a distributed way at scale. Outcomes are measured on both a short and long-term horizon. This screenshot, actually, I was talking about holdouts earlier. This screenshot is of kind of, a product holdout in action. This might be, the H1 product holdout for a given team. And last but not least, data is ultimately seen as empowering, right? People celebrate failures as much as they celebrate successes because you learn something, and that's useful in and of itself. Actually, on this, my favorite quote about celebrating failure is from Chamath Palihapitiya, who was an early Facebook growth lead. He famously recounted on the Lex Fridman podcast, about his time at Facebook growth. He said, I would celebrate teams, I would applaud these teams who ran 12 experiments and all 12 failed. And I thought this was pretty striking because, if I imagine myself in those PM's shoes, I'd be mortified if I ran 12 experiments and all 12 failed. But look, for him, this represented that they were valuing velocity and learning, and that was enough. That was great. The last thing at this kind of fly stage that's worth calling out is that as you start to scale the corpus of your historical data, you're going to be able to deploy kind of cool things like meta-analysis, right? Where you can actually look at trends amongst your metrics and kind of your historical metric trends and start to identify where it's lucrative to experiment, metrics that have moved in the past with experimentation, and where it may not be worth your time even bothering to try to experiment. And so these kind of self-learning, self-reinforcing systems can start to thrive the more data you collect. All right, so that's the framework in a nutshell. I mean, obviously everyone's team and organization starts at a different point in this progression. So there's no shame in that. We talk to folks every day who are at different kind of, entry points in this life cycle. But knowing what good looks like and what you're targeting, I think is really important. And then, last but not least, experimentation is a team sport, we like to say. And talking to other organizations, talking within your organization amongst teams, like knowledge sharing on what works and what doesn't can really help you level up faster. So that's kind of the core of what I've got. But I would love to, take questions from the audience, hear more about what folks have experienced in their organizations, and just do a little bit of our own knowledge sharing on experimentation. All right, I'm going to move to Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Margaret, for such a wonderful presentation. And we definitely have some great questions coming our way. Before we do dive into our questions, I want to remind everyone that now is the time to get straight from the source insight from Margaret-Ann. Don't be afraid to submit your questions if you have any. Additionally, we understand if you need to run. Just know that today's session is being recorded and will be emailed to you in the next 48 hours. If for some reason we don't get to your question or comment today, you can always connect with Margaret-Ann via social media. The channels are up on screen and they will be in the chat shortly. Okay, so with our remaining time, let's cover some of these questions. Our first question is coming in from Anonymous. They're super interested in the concept of teams owning outcomes, not product surfaces. Can you give an example on how such a team would set up and function logistically? And there's a second part here, but let's hit that one first. So can you give an example on how a team would set up and function logistically as far as owning outcomes, not product surfaces?
Yeah, that's a great question. Org dynamics are always fun to navigate. So typically in the past, I've seen growth teams do this really well. Growth teams are usually tasked with growing a top line number of users or an engagement metric. An example, I have a couple examples, but one that I remember was when I was working on growth at Instagram, we were given, a top line mandate of increase the number of connections that people had, i.e. the number of people that you followed on Instagram. With the theory being that the denser the network, the more content that you're following, the more engaging your feed is, and then the more kind of time spent and engagement you'll have as a user. So connections was our North Star metric, and we didn't own any surfaces within the app. We basically bopped around the entire Instagram app. And this was 2014, so it was a smaller set of surfaces. I think, the app has evolved a lot today, but we went from team to team and we said, hey, profile team, here's a set of ideas we have. Hey, Discover tab team, here's a set of ideas we have. And then we would work with these teams to implement these growth experiments, run the experiment, show what the impact was, oftentimes incorporating the, key regression metrics that those teams cared about. So if they, if Discover tab cared about your scroll depth and how many different accounts you were looking at in that tab, then we wanted to make sure that we would increase the number you followed, but not take you down some rabbit hole where you'd only, discover one account, go look at that for 30 minutes and not come back to the Discover tab and regress their kind of like scroll depth type metric. So it's a delicate balance of, you need to go work with these teams, you need to incorporate their key metrics and understand what they care about, and then run experiments that optimize for your North Star metric while not regressing their metrics. Hope that answered that question.
Thank you. And the second part of this question is, how would an IC work on other product surfaces without stepping on toes or potentially compromising the vision of the product?
Yeah. Well, so this is always tricky, right? And it's going to depend on your organization and just the dynamics. The Instagram example was clean cut because we had a mandate from the top down that we wanted to grow connections, and this was important. And so people understood that. They knew why we were coming and knocking on their door. It wasn't contentious. I think when you don't have that level of top-down organizational buy-in, you kind of have to evangelize yourself. You have to talk about why things are important. I'll contrast the Instagram example with Uber. I also worked on a growth team at Uber. Similar structure. We didn't own any surfaces. Explicitly, we had to go and kind of talk to other teams about modifying their surfaces. And international, this was very early in Uber's international journey. And so it wasn't clear yet exactly how big the opportunity was and, how important international was. And so I ended up kind of doing a roadshow. I was like my own evangelist for a good 6 months, where anyone that I would run into in the micro kitchen, in, the hallway, whatever, I would talk about the international opportunity, how fast the business was growing, how much product was a lever there. And then it wasn't a surprise when I came in and knocked on people's doors and said, hey, Rider app, we'd like to modify X, or hey, driver team, we have an idea about Y. And so I think, as an IC, it depends, like I said, how much organizational buy-in there is. And then if there isn't the buy-in, go evangelize, go talk about the opportunity and tell people, hey, we want to experiment in collaboration with you. We want to care about what you care about, ensure that your regression metrics are tracked on our experiments, and run the experiments jointly. Like, we weren't going to go off and run a ton of experiments in a black box and then ship changes to your surfaces. We're going to do it together. We're going to have experiment reviews together, design this thing together, and then make a final decision about whether this is the right thing for your surface or not. So I think it's just about that kind of priming people up front with the evangelization and opportunity, and then sitting hand holding them through, here's how we're going to work together to get this done.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you, Margaret. And if there are any follow-ups to anything we're talking about here, please feel free to go ahead and share those in our chat or our Q&A. Actually, coming back to that North Star, Kathleen has a great question. And she says, we often hear about having a North Star, but how might you align an individual product success metrics to that North Star?
Yeah, it's a good question. So a lot of times there's kind of two scenarios. There's one where you can do the backtracking. So you can say, let's say revenue, right? You care about revenue. What drives revenue? Well, it's sales driven, and there's like a product-led growth motion, let's say. And then within those, the sales motion has a set of KPIs, the product-led growth motion has a set of KPIs. You can usually track what you're doing, like bubble it up to one of those sub KPIs. So in the past, I've often done this as a literal tree exercise, where I start with like, here's the company North Star, here's how that breaks down by different levers, here's how each of those levers have driving metrics, and then I try to map what we're doing to one of those. If you can't map what you're doing to one of those, then you should actually ask, is this the right thing to be working on? And I think that's the beauty of data, is it kind of makes it more clean cut of whether you're doing something that's going to impact the business or not. And if you're not, like, I actually think it's a really mature product move to say, hey, I own this team with this KPI that doesn't seem to bubble up to anything important that this company values. Should we even be working on this? Because odds are if you don't ask that question, you don't broach that topic, someone else will, whether it's during performance reviews or a riff or whatever. Like, if something is not core to the business, you probably don't want to be working on it. And so I think it shows real product maturity to actually question that and work with leadership to figure out how you do end up focusing your efforts on something that drives top line metrics.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Thanks, Margaret Ann. Um, I'm seeing a couple questions come in regarding B2B or enterprise software. Um, let's see. So I guess the main question I'm seeing is, could this framework also work for B2B enterprises, or even applying this culture to software as a service, different kind of markets here?
Yeah. So that's a great question. The short answer is yes. The long answer is yes, with some nuance. And that nuance is that B2B in SaaS generally, you're just working with lower volumes, right? So consumer businesses, you might have more people, larger data set to experiment on, which means you can kind of run more rapid iterations and get to significance quicker. With B2B, you might have fewer users. You might wonder, hey, do I even have enough users to experiment on? And so there's just some tips and tricks that you can deploy to still experiment on smaller bases. So there's and I have a whole blog post about this, so we can share that later. But there's statistical methods that you can use that help you experiment on smaller audiences, and that help you ensure that you're still statistically rigorous with smaller audiences. And so some of these tools we built into the Statsig console, like for example, Cupid, which is outlier reduction, will help you ensure that like one outlier isn't skewing your results, and actually end up running faster experiments. Other things that you can just deploy kind of in real time. But the other nuance is in B2B, you may, on the topic of outliers, have these bigger companies that just don't behave like any of your other companies, and you actually don't want to include in an experiment. So let's say that we're running an experiment on 1,000 companies, but one of those is Amazon, right? And one of those is Google. We maybe want to ensure that Google and Amazon are being split into two different groups. So you can deploy things like stratified sampling or different stats methodologies to make sure that you're not inadvertently running a test versus control group where Amazon and Google are in the same group. So I think B2B just requires a little bit more oversight into how you set up the experiment and the stats behind it. And so choosing tooling that actually makes this easy is helpful for B2B companies.
Cool. Yeah, that makes sense to me. It's really cool stuff. Um, Kind of a follow up to that, Vlad is, wondering if there's any specific strategies you have for dealing with features where you don't expect a lot of users and, the experiment may take a long time to reach a conclusion. Just anything specific you could offer.
Yeah, so interestingly, on the don't have a lot of users, worried this is going to take a long time. One thing that we've seen a lot of is typically if you're a smaller company, you're not looking for a 1% bump in a metric or a 2% bump. You're looking for a 30, 50, 100% bump in a metric because it's not going to be meaningful to your top line impact otherwise, right? And so what's interesting is that the bigger the impact that you're looking for, the smaller the sample size you actually need to detect it. So if you're, testing something that's high in the funnel and you're looking to double the number of people that convert through it, you're typically actually going to be able to detect that faster than if you were just looking for a 1 or 2% bump. And so what we see is the smaller the company, the larger effect they're trying to detect, and then the more manageable or feasible it is to experiment. The other thing that's kind of cool is when you think about these effects, typically it's not equal in terms of detecting like a positive effect versus a negative regression, right? A positive effect might be a 2% bump, and that might take weeks or months to reach on a small sample size. But you'll immediately know if you regressed a metric, right? So let's say you launch something and it's broken. Well, that's going to result in a 100% drop in conversion or something. It's going to be a very large effect. And so As a result, you're going to be able to detect that much faster. And so it kind of has this asymmetry where it might take longer to detect positive lift, but it's going to really quickly tell you if you're negatively impacting a metric. So what I would say is, like, you may need to design your experiments with different expectations if you have smaller sample sizes, but it's still very feasible to experiment as long as you're looking for a big enough effect, experimenting on a metric that's high enough in the funnel, and you're willing to kind of say, look, as long as we don't see a big regression, that's actually a success. We're not going to wait 3 months for a small positive bump.
Yeah, thank you so much for such thorough answers. Um, our next question coming in from Tim. I think a lot of people might have this question as well and not know it yet. What are some common mistakes you see as organizations try to build out their data driven and experimental development cultures?
Whew, that's a good one. I mean, I think one that is pretty common is people get a little, what's the term? Maybe not as enthusiastic about experimentation if they aren't seeing positive experiments early, right? So if you're launching things and the results are negative or they're neutral, they might say, what's the point? Like, we're not seeing any wins. I'm not seeing the positive impact of this. And so I think that's where telling the story about, look, the fact that you caught something that was negative and you didn't launch it is really powerful, because, people oftentimes only think about positive lift. They don't think about the downside of launching something that might be really bad for your metrics. So I think that's a common one. Other than that, like, a lot of what we see at companies is just very siloed tooling and process around experimentation. So you might have a company where one team uses an old internal tool, one team's experimenting with a new, external tool. A third team is considering, their stack, and nothing's unified, which just causes a lot of confusion and chaos. The other mistake is on the internal tooling thing. A lot of folks say, okay, how hard can this be? We're just going to build an internal tool. And they go off, kind of say, here's 2 engineers fully funded to go build an internal tool. And the reality is actually, like, building, maintaining, like, keeping up to date a really good experimentation tools, a lot of work. And often I see, people come back, they evaluate Statsig year 1, say, oh, we're just going to go build it internally. Come back 3 years later or 2 years later and say, that didn't work out so well. We built the initial tool, but it was never maintained. It, didn't scale to the use cases we needed. It didn't have full-time love. And so we're actually going to go with a third-party tool in the end anyway. So those are some common ones. Trying to think about other things that go awry. Yeah. Yeah, those are probably the big ones.
Thank you. And again, any follow-ups, feel free to share here with us. We do have time for a few more questions here. Randall has a great question, very straightforward. How do you balance resources that go into experimentation, potentially ending up in, quote unquote, throwaway work, with other priorities, especially on smaller teams that might not have the resources or bandwidth to spend a month on something that could just be scrapped?
Yeah, so I'm curious what you mean by just be scrapped. Like, I do think there is kind of a minimum level of buy-in you need upfront to experimentation. It can't be something that one individual feels strongly about, but the rest of the organization thinks is useless, because then it will be scrapped. But if you have that buy-in, it should be a one-time investment that the team makes, and then you set it, forget it type thing, and can use this and scale this over time. So I'm curious about that framing, but regardless, yes, there is some trade-off, and, resources are always finite. How do you balance integrating something net new and trying something with just kind of known backlog items, whether they're bugs or improvements or customer requests or things that you just know you need to get done. And so I think, like, I'm a strong believer in nothing ever happens unless you commit to it and commit resources to it. And so being able to actually put aside dedicated resources, a small tiger team of folks whose mandate is to go and instrument a new experimentation platform. They have exit criteria, it's time bound, like, that is probably the approach I would take. I've done this in the past where basically we've said, hey, look, we're going to press pause on customer requests for 4 weeks. We need to go do a performance sprint, or we need to go integrate this new tool, or we need to go add, unit testing and logging for things. This never is good. It never feels nice, but it kind of is what you have to do if you value something. You just have to create that space to do it. And then time box it. Say it's going to be for 4 weeks and then we're done. And we're never going to come back to this again. But I think that's probably an unsatisfactory feeling answer, but that's the only thing that's worked for me in the past.
Thank you so much, Margaret-Ann. A couple of good questions I definitely want to hit here. And I've seen this come up a couple of times now. Evan is asking, could you apply this framework to an MVP phase startup with a small team? It can be a struggle for the product person to get buy-in for experimentation when early leadership just wants to get that first batch of users and they're in, kind of a go with the gut mode. Yeah, yeah, let's start with that.
Yeah. So I think this, there is a phase where you're so new and you're so small volume that you really can't experiment. So when you're building your first MVP and you have 0 users and you're trying to get to those first 10 users, you shouldn't experiment. It's just not going to work. There is some minimum threshold of users or businesses or whatever that unit is that you care about that you need to have on the platform to run experiments. Before that, though, there's a lot that you can do that still, is involving data, right? So you can log in and understand a funnel of like your 10 users, are they, where are they getting stuck in this flow? Go look at some of their sessions, like take those user IDs, go watch sessions of what they're doing, understand the nuances of where your flow might be working or not working, and then go back to the drawing board. So there's still spot instances there, but at some level, you should just talk to people. You should, set up an alert so that every time someone logs in, you get a ping and then you can go see what they're doing. You can reach out to them afterwards and get feedback. Just because I love data and I love experimentation, I'm not anti-research or anti-talking to your users. I think there's really a place for both. And when you're so small, the go with your gut works to get going, but then immediately, as soon as you have those first couple of users, get the feedback mechanisms in, whether they're, quantitative data ones or more qualitative ones. And this is where things like session recording and, some of these more qualitative research tools are actually really awesome. And I've been at startups where we were exactly in that boat, 0 to 1, had a hypothesis, launched it, and then, talked to people, got feedback. And as the numbers grew, transitioned into a more data-driven mode.
Great advice. Thank you. And another question coming in from Anonymous, changing direction a little bit here. We want to experiment, but we're way behind at collecting clean data. So how might we justify the investment needed to build out the data infrastructure that we need for that walk stage and be able to start being more experimentation driven?
Yeah. So this is a pretty classic one. And the Anonymous, you're not alone. There's a lot of companies in this boat. It's interesting. We offer 2 models. We have like a cloud hosted model where you kind of use our SDK to log events and set up a new metrics catalog that's hosted on our cloud. And then we have a warehouse native version, which is people who already maybe have metrics defined in their warehouse. We just kind of sit in your warehouse and do all the stats computations there without having to egress any data. And what's interesting is a lot of customers wanted this data warehouse version because they have a canonical metrics catalog. They don't want to redefine metrics anywhere else. They trust their data. It's awesome. But a lot of customers actually cited that they have a warehouse, they have metrics, they're just a little bit of a mess. They don't trust them. There's multiple sources of truth. They're not in a good state. They don't think their data is kind of ready to be the canonical source of truth. And so they go with our cloud version because they want to actually reset, kind of do a clean refresh, redefine their metrics, only define the metrics that they need for the experiments that they're running, and kind of start from scratch in the cloud. So this happens a lot and it's not uncommon. I think if you're using a third-party platform, the hosted ones do provide this opportunity where you basically are only going to get the metrics that you send in, whether that's via logging events with SDKs and then kind of creating metrics from them, or importing explicitly certain metrics from your database, in your warehouse, in which case you can kind of fine tune which ones you want to import or not. But you basically create a new walled garden where you can start from scratch. And so that's attractive to some teams. That might be something you want to consider if you don't think your data is in a really good state. And then it gives you kind of a clean refresh opportunity.
Thank you. Moving right along here so we can squeeze in a couple of more. Alan is asking, how do you measure the metrics of the experimental features without actually releasing them in production?
Well, we don't. We release them in production and measure the metrics there. I mean, we do a lot of pre-production testing, but if you actually want to run experiments on real users, you're going to have to launch it in production. And so we have all our core metrics instrumented to, measure, for example, uplift metrics like growth or revenue, but also regression metrics like page load times, performance, average route load, stuff like that. But it's all on production data. So that would be my advice. If you really want to experiment, you kind of need to do it with your real users in prod.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Um, a pretty interesting question coming in from Hunter. Can you go into the difference in being data driven versus maybe data led, and how that might impact experimentation culture if it does?
Yeah, this is a good one. This is a hot topic these days because you've got folks like Brian Chesky and Karin at Linear coming out and saying, we don't want to use data. We don't want to have PMs leading. We want to be more intuition and design driven. And I do, like I said earlier, there's a place for both. You don't want to get to a point where you're only running experiments that are basically pigeonholing you into micro optimizing this like little molehill that's next to this huge mountain that you can't see because it's not part of what you would optimize if you were, experimenting. So you have to kind of see the forest through the trees and zoom out and say, what's the landscape? What are the things we could be optimizing? What are the opportunities we could be pursuing? And a lot of that exercise might be more gut and intuition than data. But then once you zoom back in and you say, here's the problem we've chosen to go solve, you can take an initial swing at that, but then there's going to be a lot of rounds of optimization, and that's where experimentation comes in. And so I think that it is a mix. You don't want to be blind to the broader ecosystem, broader opportunities, which would be the data led, where you're just so laser focused on like optimizing this one metric that you can't see you're actually literally working on the wrong metric. But at the same time, building that muscle that when you do figure out what you care about, honing in on that, optimizing that, and being able to execute there is huge. So I think it's a mix. And if, I'm not a CEO, but if I were a CEO, if I were Brian Chesky, I think I would probably say there's room for both, data and research and human feeling and interaction and kind of just gut feel in the product development process.
Yeah, yeah, I love that question and I love that answer. Thank you. We have a kind of a fun question coming in again from Anonymous. Um, what resources or recommendations or training starting points do you have for successfully transitioning into a career in product management like you have?
Ooh, PM. Yeah, good question. So typically what I've seen, so I've worked with a lot of folks who have transitioned from other roles into product. And typically what I have seen be successful is when you're looking to make a transition, there's a lot of variables. And the more you can isolate to just changing one variable at a time, the better. Kind of comes back to my like, don't ship 10 changes at the same time because you won't know what didn't work. But what I mean by this is basically like, let's say I'm a data analyst. Becoming a PM in a data product or in a data heavy role would be a really good transition path because I'm changing the role. So I'm going from analyst to PM or data scientist to PM, but I'm not changing the domain. Like the domain is still data or experimentation or something I'm comfortable and well versed in. Similarly at Uber, there were a lot of folks that transitioned into product and that they would do it in an area that they already had deep expertise in because it just gave them a leg up. They already understood the space. They already understood, how to converse and be thoughtful in that area. And I think that isolating it to one change at a time is always good advice. I don't have any specific blogs or resources. It typically was like, in my experience, finding someone who, in that area that you are an expert in, saying, hey, you've got great ideas. you have something to contribute. I'm going to sponsor you or kind of, advocate for you taking on this new role. Finding that champion is huge. Like, I just think that 90% of the people that I know who were successful in transitioning roles, it was because they had some champion on the inside and they were doing it in a space that like they understood deeply.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And for our last question here, I'm going to ask you, Margaret-Ann, what is the biggest takeaway you think everybody should get from today's presentation?
Yeah, I mean, I think my goal was to show that experimentation and kind of transitioning into this more data-driven culture isn't scary. It's not intimidating. It is a process. It's a, multi-step journey and it will take a while, but like everyone starts somewhere and you crawl before you walk, before you run. And experimentation is no different. So I think the goal is it's accessible. You should figure out how to, do it. Maybe it's at a team level and then that scales to your broader organization and then the company. But everyone starts somewhere and we all hop on the framework at a different point.
Thank you. Thank you so much for such a wonderful, wonderful chat. With that, that is all we have time for today. I hope you all learned half as much as I did. If we didn't get to your question or your comment today, again, please feel free to follow up with Margaret-Ann after today's session. And before we go, I'd like to encourage you to participate in the survey that will pop up in your browser after the webinar closes. And this feedback helps us, continue to produce webinars that you genuinely enjoy and find value in, just like this one. Thank you again to our sponsor, Statsig, and Margaret-Ann, a big special thank you to you for such a phenomenal presentation and discussion today.
Thank you for the questions. These were great questions, really engaging.
Absolutely. Thank you to all of you for attending and spending some time with us. My name is Tara, and I hope you have a great rest of your day, a great rest of your week. Take care.
Yeah.